We are now moving on to principles of natural selection. So we talked about this in biology, but we're going to spend some more background time and also go into a little more detail than we did in biology. So this is concept 1 for evolution. When talking about evolution, we are talking about the process of biological change in a population over time. And this is making the descendants genetically different from their ancestors. So it's important to note here that we are talking about biological change in populations, not in individuals, over time. So these are important things that we will come back and point out again later, but we're first going to talk about the two different types of evolution that we can see. And the first is evolution that can occur on a small scale. This is affecting a single population, and we call this microevolution. And that brings us to our second type, which happens on a large scale, affecting changes in species across many populations, and we call this macroevolution. So if you notice, you don't have anything to write down in your notes here, but we're just emphasizing some of the things that we talked about in our timeline. So some other things that were believed before the introduction of evolution through natural selection. So first we have creationism, then we have catastrophism, and catastrophism is like the Big Bang Theory essentially, where there was some big catastrophic event is causing the change. Then we have gradualism, which was from Hutton, which some of you would have researched. And gradualism is saying that the change that we see occurs over a very slow amount of time. Then we have struggle for existence. And so this would mean that like competition is what is causing our change, or some struggle for survival. Then we have uniformitarianism, long word, and that's meaning that everything is staying uniform. Everything stays the same, which we can note from looking at geological changes that everything does not stay the same on the Earth. So we can use the Grand Canyon as an example. Then my favorite, the inheritance of acquired traits from Mr. Lamarck. And what the inheritance of acquired traits is, the example I always like to use in biology is that if I accidentally chopped off my finger, my pinky, then all of my children would be born without a pinky also, because I acquired that as a trait, and that's what I would pass on. We obviously know that is incorrect. And then lastly, we have intelligent design, which is similar to creationism, but it doesn't necessarily specify as to what is planning or creating the design. And this brings us to Charles Darwin. So there's a long history to Darwin being the father of evolution, but he is not the one who discovered evolution. He did not create the idea of evolution, but his proprietary idea is that he came up with natural selection, which is the mechanism for evolution. So natural selection states that with the best traits or adaptations will live longer and reproduce more than others. So this part is really important, that we are focusing on living longer and reproducing, because really that is our goal of our life. So these two things causing changes in populations over time by acting on traits that are heritable, meaning that it's based on your genetics. And this brings us to the term you hear a lot, but we don't always fully understand what it means, and that is survival of the fittest. And when we say fittest, we're talking about fitness, which is a measure of how well you can survive in your environment. So it doesn't necessarily mean biggest, fastest, and strongest, but it's your ability to survive and how well you can do that. And then we have some principles in which natural selection is based on, which we will talk about shortly. So the first principle of natural selection that we're going to talk about is the overproduction of offspring. And what this means is that we are going to have lots of offspring and a limited amount of resources, and because of these things, it's going to cause competition for those resources. So as long as there's some sort of competition going on, whether that is for limited resources or affecting your survival in any way, is going to lead to natural selection. The next principle of natural selection that we have is variation. And variation is the differences in the physical traits of organisms. So any sort of difference. So in our picture here, we have flowers, and most of these flowers are purple, but then we also have some white ones, and obviously there can be many, many different colors of hydrangeas. So any sort of variation, any sort of physical differences. We're going to focus on the different sources of variation that we can have in organisms. And the first one is random mutations. And these are essentially our ultimate source of variation. They are providing the most source of diversity that we have. Then we have genetic recombination, which is just a fancy way of saying crossing over from meiosis. If you remember, during our metaphase, when our chromosomes line up in the middle, they exchange some of their pieces, and this allows new genes to occur. And then lastly, we have migration or gene flow. So new genes coming into your population is also a source of variation. The next principle we have is adaptations. And adaptations is a feature that allows an organism to better survive in its environment, whatever that adaptation may be, as long as it's increasing the survival. With adaptations, typically our beneficial traits or beneficial adaptations will become more common over time, so we'll see an increase of them as survival increases, because organisms should be living longer and therefore reproducing more, which means that if we're increasing survival, we are changing the gene pool, and the gene pool is the combined alleles of all individuals in a population. So I like to think of gene pool like a literal pool. And we know that if we think back to our genetics from biology, if we talk about hair color, big B is for brown hair and little b is for blonde hair. So I have brown hair, so we're just going to guess that I am big B. And other people in this class, if they have blonde hair, will be little b. Or maybe they're big B, little b because they have a blonde parent. We could write this out for everyone, and that is our literal gene pool, everybody in the population. And the last principle we have is descent with modification. And descent with modification means that we are going to have a change in gene frequency over time. So if you think about gene frequency, this is your genes, your genetics, and how often they appear over time. And this means that natural selection leads to populations with new phenotypes adapted to new situations if we're changing the gene pool over a period of time. But it is important to keep in mind that any traits that we have in these new phenotypes that we have come from their ancestors. We don't just get to make new traits because they'd be cool, but they always have to be inherited from someone. Which means that, again, our beneficial traits should become more common over time. So before we move on, it's important to note that our individuals are not evolving. You are inheriting your traits from your ancestors. So you don't get to change the genes you have within your lifetime. Individuals do not evolve, but populations do. We can change what the genes of the next generation are going to look like.